Okay, we said that a computer program, is a set of instructions okay, we write for the computer to execute. Okay. Okay. So this is the definition of a computer program. A computer program has a structure. It has a structure. Like if you are writing a piece of not a paragraph, but if you're writing a composition piece, or if you're writing an essay in English language, then this essay has an introduction, then it has the body of the essay, and then the conclusion, right? Same thing for a program. A program has three distinct parts that apply to any program that you will ever write. So any program has three components that I want you to look at, right? Any program we are going to write at this one. I want this to be in red. Okay. Any program that we are going to write has the following format. We start with getting data to the program. Okay. The goal of any program is to get data and do some operations on this data, right? Especially in Excel. So our first step always is to provide our program with the data the program will work on. Okay. In programming language term, this is called input. Okay. Getting input for your program. Okay. In the example we just did, we entered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the program, right? So this input can take different format. Okay. It can be user entered, and we will look at that today, hopefully, or if not, then Thursday. User entered. We can also get it from an Excel sheet. Okay. We can also get it from another program. Okay. So the first step in when you are writing your code, something you need to think of when you are writing your code is the input. Where am I getting my data in order to process this data, in order to do some operations on this data? Okay. But always the first step is to get data into your program. Once you get your data, right, you need to do some operations on the data, right? So using the data in some functions. Or manipulating the data. Okay. So the next step is we have our data already. We need to use our data in some way. We need to do summation functions. We need to get their average. We need to check for something in the data. We need to manipulate this data, right? This is called, in programming language vocabulary, this is called processing. Okay, data processing. Okay, so this is where you process your data. Okay, examples of this include things like summation, like average, like any other function you can think of. We can do lots of things with data. We'll look at some examples. Okay, and then after we have processed our data, right, we need to use the outcome of the processing, right? We need to use the outcome of this processing, give it to the user, we display to the user, we can send it to the Excel workbook, we can do anything with it, but we have to use the data that was processed, right? So here we are going to provide the results of processing the data. something we call in programming terms output. Okay. For example, we can display results to users. We can write the results in Excel and so on. Okay. Right. So this is the structure of any computer program you will ever write in your life, whether it's in Visual Basic or in any other programming language that you will ever use. So if you're interested in information systems and you take one of the advanced courses in information systems, you will be using R language or Python or any other language. Whatever language you will be using, I want you to think of this structure. We are going to get data into our program, an operation we call getting input or input to the program, and then processing the data, doing some work on the data. This work can be very simple, like summing up the data, or it can be more complex, as we will see as we go on through this course. Okay. And then after you process your data, you are going to you process the data for a purpose. So you are going to provide the results of this processing to your users or to some place else. This is called an output. This is the structure of any program that you will ever work with in your life. Okay. Now, does anyone have any questions about this structure before we get things a little bit more complex? Any questions about this structure? Is it clear for everyone? Okay, perfect. All right, now there is a keyword. Okay, perfect. Now there is a keyword here that I want you to look at and tell me what is the shared word among the three steps here. There is a shared word among the three steps that you see in front of you. What is this? Data. Excellent, Jacob. Yes, data, right? We are getting the data, processing the data, and displaying the results of the data, right? So in order for us to use this data, okay, in order for us to use this data, we need a way to save it. We need a way to store the data in our program, right? We need a method or a tool that will allow us to store our data in our program so we can use it later on. Okay, right? So what is this tool? Again, in all programming language, we have something called variables. Okay. In English, a variable means something that changes, right? Something variable means something that changes. A variable in programming is a memory location, a location in the memory where you can store your data. Okay. Again, a variable in programming is a location in the computer memory where you store a piece of data, store a number, store some text, store an image, store whatever data you have in your code. You can store it in a memory location, and this memory location called variable. Okay. So variables are very important in programming. Variables are key things in programming. Without variables, we don't have program. Okay. The role of the variable is to store the data we are going to use in our program. So whenever you want to use data in your program, you have to create a variable to hold this data. We will look at how to create variables in a few minutes, but I just want you guys to be very clear about this. So again, a variable is, let me show that. Okay. Okay. So this is all governed by something called a variable. Okay. A variable is very important in programming. Why? Because it helps you to get the input to the program. Once we get data into the program, we put this data into variables, right? And we use these variables in the processing phase and to show output to the user. Okay. So the rule of thumb to simplify programming for you guys, whenever you use data in your code, you have to have this data in a variable. Okay, I will show you how to create variables in a few minutes. Okay, right? What is a variable? A variable is a location in the computer memory that stores your data. All right. Okay. Now I want you to remember this slide carefully as we move on, because we are going to start working on some simple code, some simple programming right now. Okay, so make sure you have this slide, go through it, make sure you understand everything here. And we are going to move back to Visual Basic for applications and apply it to a small program. Okay. All right. So now what we are going to do is we will learn, because variables are very important, they are essential for us to get our data. We'll start by understanding what is a variable. Okay. And once we understand what is a variable and how to create a variable in our code, we are going to move to the next phase, which is how to use this variable to get input and do some processing and so on and so forth. Okay. Right. So I'm going to share my screen again now. And let's open my presentation. Right. Okay. So when we talk about variables, there are two types of variables we can use in our program. Okay. A variable that changes from the value or inside the variable changes throughout the program. This is actually called a variable. Okay. So for example, if I am going through student records and I want to create a variable to hold your test result, then this variable will change from one student to the other. So when I move from one student to the next student, the value inside this variable will change. Okay, this is called a variable. Another type of variables we use is called a constant. A constant is a value, it's also created as a variable, but the data inside the constant does not change during the program execution. Okay, right? So examples of constant like tax percentage, like discount for some company and so on. So a constant is a value that you are going to use as is throughout the program. Okay. Right. So if we look at this example, guys, and I want you to look at these examples and tell me which one of these are variables and which are constant. So the first one says C2 times F10. Is this a variable or a constant? Okay, so I'll answer. Yeah. Yes. So guys, this is indeed a variable. Why is it a variable? This is a cell number C2 and cell number F10. These cells can take any value. I can put 5 in C2 and then change it to 10 and then change it to 15 and then change it to 25, right? So this is a cell, right? In Excel cells, we can change the value from time to time, or we can always change the values inside the cell. So Excel cells are considered to be variables. Excel cells are considered to be variables because you can put any value in an Excel cell and you can replace it with another value. So this is a variable. Okay. Now let's look at the second statement. C2 absolute value of C2 multiplied by F10. Is this a variable or a constant? This is not an exam, guys, so think about it for a minute and let me know. Okay. No, this is actually still a variable. Why is it a variable? because I'm still using cells. So C2 is a cell. So even though I am looking at C2 specifically, it is still a cell. Okay, so any cell in Excel is a variable. You can put any value in C2, right? In the third one, 25 times F10. Okay, is this a variable or a constant? Based on what I just said. Variable, right, Nelly? This is also a variable because I have F10, right? Yes, Fakhriya, you are absolutely right. F10 is a cell, even though the row is fixed, but still it is a cell, right? So again, this is a constant, right? What about the last one? 25 times 32. Is this a constant or a variable? Constant, right? Excellent, guys. Yes, this is a constant because I have actual numbers here. These are numbers, right? So numbers are constant. There is nothing to change here. So this is a constant, okay? So a variable is something that can change during the program execution, but a constant does not change, right? When we have numbers, explicit numbers like this is a constant. When we have cells, this is a variable. Right? So how do we create a variable in VBA? We create variables in VBA using a vocabulary word called dim, D-I-M. DIM comes from the word dimension. Dimension is an old name for variables. In old programming languages, variables used to be called dimensions, okay? So dim is a vocabulary word in Visual Basic for application that means I want to create a variable, okay? After you put the word dim, which is a vocabulary, you input the variable name that you want to create, okay? So for example, dim some numbers, dim average numbers, and so on. So you give a name to this variable, and then we use the word as. And then what type of variable is this? Is it a number? Is it text? Is it currency? Is it a date? Okay. So data type means what type of data will be stored in this variable. Okay. Right. So again, in order for us to create a variable in our program, we need to use this statement. Dim, D-I-M, means dimension or create a new variable. And then we put the variable name. You can use any name for your variable name. And then the word as. And then the type of data that you are going to use for your variable. Okay. Now, these are some of the data types that we can use when we are working with with creating variables, right? I want you to use this as a reference. Once we start programming, use this slide as a reference to the types of variables you can create in VBA. We have many of them. I will go through the most important, right? So the most important one includes Boolean. Boolean means logical value, so true or false. Okay. The other important one is integer. Integer is whole numbers. Okay, whole numbers. Okay. And then we have long. Long is for very big integers. So if we have a whole number with no decimal points, and this number is greater than 32,000, then we use the long instead. Okay. So integer and long are the same thing, but long can accommodate bigger integers. Okay. And if you have decimal points, then we use double. Okay, so double is used for decimal points. So if you want to store your grade value, and your grade can be 90.5, for example, then you store it as a double. If you want to store a salary, salaries can have decimal points, you store it as a double. Okay. If you have ages, for example, if you have a number of students and so on, you can use integers. The final important variable is string. String is used to store text. Okay, so if you want to create a text in your program, we create a variable of the type string. Okay, we'll see examples of these as we go on. But what I want you to know now is, depending on the data you will use in your program, you have to select a different data type. Okay, so don't be confused here, guys. So if you are creating a string, if you are using text in your program, you need to create it as string. If you are using a decimal number, double. If you are using a whole number, then integer or long will work. Okay, we will go through many examples, and hopefully as we go through examples, this will become easier for you to understand. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to go now to Visual Basic for application, and we'll go through the steps of writing a simple program. Okay, but before I do that, again, there is very good practice I want to share with you that will help you tremendously, again, in this course and in later courses. Right, we looked at, let me go back to my whiteboard. Okay, we said the structure of the program is getting data, processing the data, and outputting the results of our processing, and this is all governed by the variable. Okay, so always the first step when you are writing a program, the first step is always to design your program. Okay, you have to design the program before writing. Let me show you an example. So for example, if I decide that what I want to do is this is a question, for example, right? A program to get two numbers from the user, add these numbers, and display the result of the of the addition. Okay, so this is a simple program. I want to create a program. You are going to get two users from two values, two data or two numbers from a user, add them up, and display the results of the addition back to the user, right? So before you start working on Visual Basic for applications, you need to design this program, see how this program is going to flow, right? So how do we do this? Okay, we convert this question, this problem question, into the components of the program. So what is our input? What is our output? What is the processing we will be using? And finally, what are the variables we will be using that we need for this program? Okay, so I'm going to map the question. I will map it to the program structure that I just described. So the first thing is input. So our input here is two numbers. Let's call these numbers number 1 and number 2. Okay, right? And let's say in this example, we're going to use whole numbers, so they are integers. Okay, and then we have our processing, data processing, adding the numbers. Okay, so the processing is we're going to add these numbers up. Okay, and our output is the sum of the two numbers. Okay, so I mapped my question. This is the question that I have, and I mapped it to the three components of the program that we talked about: input, data processing, and output. Right now, before again I start touching my VBA, I need to understand what variables do I need in this program. What are the variables do I need here? And remember, a variable is a place to hold the data I will be using in my program. So in order to know what variables do I need to see what data I will be using in this program. So based on your understanding of the program so far, what are the variables I will need here, guys? What variables do I need in this program? To know the variables, find out the data that we will be using throughout the program, and for each piece of data we need a variable. So how many variables, at least how many variables do we need here? Okay, so look at, don't be afraid, this is how we learn. Okay, so think about it for a minute and tell me how many variables and what are these variables that we need to use in this program. I already helped you. If you look closely, you will see what variables we will use. Please, guys, have courage. Don't worry. Nelly said 2 and Maritza said 3. Okay. Anyone else? You are increasing. Okay. All right. Okay, perfect. All right. So, okay. So let's see. The first thing is we're going to get 2 pieces of data from the user. So we need 2 variables to hold this data we're going to get from the user. So we need these 2 variables, num1 and num2, that I displayed right in front of you here, guys. So we have num1 and num2. These are variables that will hold the data we are going to get from the user. Okay, so at least we need 2 variables to hold this input, at least, right? And if you look at the program, you will see that we are going to add this number. So once we add up the numbers, we'll come up with a new number. We'll come up with a third number, which is the summation of the 2 numbers, right? So we have the 2 values we are going to get from the user. Okay, so these are 2 variables. And then we need a third variable to hold the summation of the 2 numbers. Okay. All right. So let's see how we write this code, right? So again, the variables we need, whenever you have data you are going to use in your program, you need to store this data in a variable, right? So here I am storing the 2 inputs from the user, number 1 and number 2. And I have also the sum. So let's see, let's go to Visual Basic for applications now, and we are going to translate this into code. Right, so let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to use some things that we haven't talked about yet, but it's just to demonstrate to you that how we write the code, right? So I'm going to write the code now. The best way to write code in Visual Basic for applications without getting confused about forgetting something is to start from Excel. Okay, so I will go to Excel and I'm going to record a new macro. Okay, I will call it add numbers, for example, add numbers. Okay, and then I will press OK. And then I'm going to stop recording, right? I haven't done anything. Before doing anything, I started recording my macro and then stop recording. Okay. Now, if I go to Visual Basic for application, I will find that I have an empty macro created for me, right? Right. Now, make sure that we are starting to write in a location with no single quotation, right? So if you have a single quotation, then this is a comment. So I started in a new line without any quotations before it, right? Right. And then I will start creating my variables. Okay, I'm going to create 3 variables, 1 for the first number, a second for the second number, and a third for the summation of the 2 numbers. So I do it like this, dim, right? And then I enter the variable name. When you create a variable, the variable name has the same rules as macro names. So no spaces, no special characters except underscore, okay, and so on, right? So dim, and then I will create the first number. The first number is an integer, right? We said we are going to create them as integers. So in order to make my code more readable, when you are creating an integer variable, we start by entering int. Int means this is an integer variable, followed by the name we want to give to the variable. So int number one means this value is number one and it is of type integer, and then integer. Okay. So now I created a variable. This is the name of the variable. Okay. You can call your variable whatever. I can call this Muhammad. Okay. Name Muhammad as integer. I can call this car as integer. I can call this anything. The name of the variable is arbitrary. You can select any name for your variables, but it's good practice to use a meaningful name, right? So I used integer num1, but you can use whatever name you want to use. Okay. And then we are going to create the other variables. So dim, again, int num2 as integer. Okay. And then I will create a third variable for the sum. So dim int sum as integer. Okay. So again, to revise, why I entered the variable like this. Dim is a vocabulary. This is a keyword, a vocabulary word in Visual Basic for application, followed by the variable name, and then the word as, and then the type of data. Here I use the integer because I'm going to get two whole numbers from the user, and I'm going to display a whole number to the user. Okay, so this is why I created them as integers. If I wanted to use decimal numbers, then I would use double instead of integer. Okay, so we select the type of data depending on what data we will be using from in our program. Dim it means dimension. It's a keyword. It's a vocabulary word that we use to create variables in Visual Basic. Okay. Right. So here I'm creating the variable. The next step after creating my variable is we get input from the user. So I will create a comment here so everyone knows what's going to happen after this. So getting input from the user. Okay. To get input from the user, we are going to use a function in Visual Basic that I will talk about later on. So you don't have to know what this is, guys. This is a way to get input from the user, right? So I want to get input from the user and store this input in a variable. Okay, so whatever value the user enters will be stored in a variable, right? So int num1. This is the variable that I just created. So int num1. Okay, right? This is the same variable I created above. So I have int num1 here. Okay, I have int num1 here, and I'm going to use this variable to store the value entered by the user. So equals input box. Input box is a function we'll talk about later on. Is enter the first number. Okay. Right. And then, so input box, the input box function, we'll talk about that in details this week, right? The input box function is going to get data from the user, as I will show you how in a minute, right? And this data I will get from the user, I'm going to save it in a variable called int num1. Okay. And then same thing for int num2 equals input box is enter the second number. Okay. So now I have received my input from the user. I have two inputs, number 1 and number 2. And now I want to process this data. So add up the two numbers. Okay, right? So to add up the two numbers, I will say int num1 plus int num2. Okay. Now, in order for me to add them up, I need to store the result of this addition in another variable, right? So I'm going to add the two numbers up. For example, 5 plus 2, I will have 7. So this value of 7, I need to store it somewhere. I'm going to store it in the int sum variable. So I will use int sum equals int num1 plus int num2, right? So here I did the processing. I added up the two numbers. This is the processing of my data. And I saved or stored the outcome of the addition in a new variable called int sum. Okay. And finally, I'm going to display the result. The result is displayed with output. So I'm going to output the result of processing the data. Okay. To output the processing, there is another function called message box. Again, we'll talk about that today. Message box int sum. Okay. This message box is going to display the value inside the variable int sum. Okay. Right. So the names of the function input boxes and message box, we'll go through these in details. But for now, again, there are a few things that I want you to look at. The first thing is the importance of variables. Whenever I had a piece of data, getting data from the user here, I stored this data inside a variable. Okay. Whenever I created new data in my program, like when adding up the two numbers together, I used variable. Okay. And then I displayed the summation in a message box at the end, right? So variables are very important in a computer program. So before you start working on your program, you need to think about the variables that you want to use in your code. And even if you forget, if you are designing the program and you forgot about one of the variables you may need, when you are actually writing your code, whenever you create a new piece of data, you need to store this new piece of data in a variable. So variables are very important. Okay. This is the first thing. The second thing is the structure of the program. Again, I showed that to you in a whiteboard, but this is how we convert this into code, right? The first step is to create our variables at the very top of our macro. And then we use our variables to get our data input. And then we process our data. And then we display some output. Okay. Any question, guys, about this structure? I will leave it for a minute, and then we will run this program, and we will see how it works. We will see how it works.
So we're kind of just like breaking it down step by step.
Do you want me to go through it again step by step?
No, I'm just asking, like, is that what we're doing? We're just kind of breaking it down.
Yes. So this is the process you should go through when you are developing a piece of code. So if you get a question asking you to do something, this is how you think about the program. You think about the program in terms of the process input, processing output, and what variables you need in order to develop this program, right? And then we use the vocabulary that we will learn in this class to convert your logic into coding. Okay. All right. So let's run this program and see how it works, right? So we can run the program from Visual Basic for Applications directly. If you look here at the top, guys, you will see that we have a button like an old Walkman run button, and then pause and then stop right here. So I'm going to click run. Okay, and you can see that I have a message box or a box that asks me about the first number. This is the first number that is in our code. So I will enter some value 5. Okay. Then I will be asked about the second number. So I can enter something like 7. And the result displayed, as you can see, is 12. 7 plus 5 is 12. Okay. So our program is working fine. We start by getting 2 inputs from the user, adding them up and displaying the result. Again, I will do it one more time. Run. 2. Okay. First number is 2. Second number is 3. And the result is 5. Okay. Right. So it is working as expected. Okay. So again, there are many things that we haven't covered yet, but the key thing that the key takeaway from this piece of code, guys, is, or this macro, is the structure. The structure. We have to have variables to hold our data, get input, whether this input is from the user or from Excel sheets, and then processing the data, and then displaying output to the user. Okay, so all programs are like this in any programming language, not just VBA, in any programming language that you will ever use in your life. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Right. Right. So now let's start with our first programming structure or first programming vocabulary that we will work with, or second. We talked about